here's what we've seen works regionally. Public safety, right? And so sometimes we have sheriff deputies, for example, to cover an entire county. Or perhaps there's a state police post that covers a region of a state. Or perhaps there's joint fire departments, right, that work geographically. Pretty easy stuff. Sometimes we may have regional infrastructure investments. Maybe it's a water district or a sewer district, right? Transportation, the highway system that we have. Sometimes it is an educational system, right? That brings us together. Maybe a regional K-12 ISDs, intermediate school districts. Maybe it's K-12 education, or local community colleges. But there's others that probably bring us together as a region. So I want you to kind of reflect again. What are the things that kind of keep you from working even better together? What are some of those? Turf wars, absolutely. Distance, physical distance, absolutely. And a turf war is a big thing, right? In terms of what's mine's mine and what's yours is ours, right? Is sometimes what we think. And then there's these community rivalries. Sometimes they're based on, sports rivalries with high schools and those type of things. Distance, another huge one, yes? Different industries, right. So the sectors, you don't see yourself necessarily connecting with that community because, okay, they're doing their stuff and we're over here, right? And so to your point earlier in terms of, well, maybe there's different regions that we connect and we can pivot to based on what we need, but sometimes we look at the things that keep us apart versus potential to keep us together or bring us together. Yeah. Losing identities. So, yeah, so what you're saying is, well, if we work more broadly, what does that mean to my community, right? Because we're all a little parochial, right? That's just human nature, yeah. Old-timers, newcomers, absolutely. Yeah, particularly on the leadership, we're going to get to that. You're teeing that up. Well, you guys warmed up now, aren't you?
Lack of transportation options to traverse the distances.
Yeah, so it kind of goes a little deeper in terms of, not only is it physically, but just, kind of meandering there. There's not an easy way to get from here to there.
Or aside from just a personal vehicle, there's no bus.
No bus, public transportation, absolutely. Good stuff. Really good stuff. Sometimes the low-hanging fruit in terms of what brings us together as a region isn't the best. It's not the easy thing that brings us together isn't maybe the best thing that brings us together. And I think this cartoon illustrates it. The low-hanging fruit isn't always the sweetest, right? It's good, but sometimes we stop there. If rural Wisconsin, rural Michigan where I'm from, rural America is going to compete, it's going to mean that we're going to have to work together in ways that probably heretofore we haven't, right? In terms of trying to marshal our resources in a different manner. Darwin has a great quote. He says, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the weakest, but those most responsive to change. Those most responsive to change. I talked about it a little bit this morning, but from a regional perspective, we're going to have to change how we think, act, and do things differently. The reality is if you look at global competition, after World War II, the United States dominated the world economy. But if we look recently, last 10 years, growth is increasingly happening elsewhere, primarily the BRIC countries. China, Brazil, India, Russia. So the question is America declining or is the rest of the world catching up? I think it's the latter. The reality is we have new competitors, but with that comes perhaps new opportunities. And we have to recognize as leaders in rural places that the rules have changed. We now have to say we're not competing with that town down the road in Wisconsin or across the border in Minnesota or down to the south in Iowa, Illinois, get my geography right. But rather we're competing on a global stage in many industries. Not all, but in many industries. And if so, we have to also recognize that our competitors, particularly our foreign competitors, have a much more flexible infrastructure, easier decision making, better partnerships than perhaps we have here in our states. They don't have our legacy costs that sometimes hamper our ability to be lighter on our feet. And you know what? They really don't care about us. I know it's disheartening, but the reality is they don't care about us. And so what we have to do is change how we act, how we think, how we do business at a much different level than we have in the past. We have to recognize that the world is changing. So I think if I'm historical in terms of looking at different waves, there's really 3 different waves of economic. Well, let me back up. I'm getting one slide ahead of myself. Apologize. There are some mega trends that are at play. 1, there's an expanded importance of creative and knowledge economies. We're also seeing a mega trend in terms of subdividing or outsourcing the various value chain functions into more interdependent activities. We're seeing regions become more specialized and saying, you know what, we can compete in this area. We can make the best cheese in the world, and we're going to sell it globally. Okay? And we're seeing expanded growth of entrepreneurs and self-employed. The other thing is that we're seeing regions connect with other regions that have resources that they could rely on. And this is new. It used to be we were vertically integrated. We wanted to kind of have everything come into ourselves. So really, this is what I want to get to. There's been 3 waves of economic development. And we're kind of at the 3rd wave for my analysis. So the first wave was all about industrial recruiting. And I'd venture to say some in this room did this wave, right? Some of you were about filling your industrial parks, right? And how we did that, we offered subsidies, tax abatements, tax breaks. We provided infrastructure. And then from there, it became all about retaining and expanding businesses. We did that primarily through deregulation. But we'd had some workforce development. So some of these things are continuing. It's good. But I contend we're now on a 3rd wave. And Paul Romer, who is a Nobel Prize in economics, I think, summarizes it best in terms of where we are. He says, economic growth occurs where people take resources and rearrange them in ways that are more valuable. Take your resources and rearrange them in ways that are more valuable. Okay? Said another way, it's not coming from better recipes. Or excuse me, it comes from better recipes, not more cooking. Right? And so that's what you're going to have to do as rural communities in Wisconsin. How do we create better recipes from our collective assets? And that really feeds into the 3rd wave in terms of where we are from an economic development perspective, and that's really regional competitiveness. And so the strategies to do that is entrepreneurship, regional collaboration, and identification and the development of regional clusters. And I'll kind of unpack that a little bit later in terms of what that means. I contend that we're kind of at the end of a curve that was part of our grandfather's economy, right? And our prosperity kind of is, if we rely on our grandfather's economy, is dipping off. And what we need to do is kind of create a new curve that is based on our grandchildren's economy, right? And we're kind of at that sweet spot right now in terms of, all right, how do we create that new curve? And there's a lot of different strategies in terms of regional tourism, regional food systems, innovation hubs that may provide pathways to get there. When we look back at our grandfather's economy, everything was pretty well segregated, right? People kind of stayed in their lane. Unfortunately, oftentimes when I look at regions and communities, particularly in rural places, that are trying to transition into their grandchildren's economy, they're not really responding differently. we're often stuck in our lanes. You know, it's almost as if we have one of those invisible fences, those collars that we put on dogs. You know, we go to work with the community, we kind of get shocked, right? It's cool how that flashes, isn't it? So we're going to have to take that collar off. And it starts with really looking at, well, who are our opportunities, or where do our opportunities lie? And how do we define our region, and what is a region? Well, in a region is some similarities, whether it be geographic or others, similar within and differences between, right? To your point earlier, it's a place of interest with unique identity and meaning. So there's a lot of different scales if we just look at Wisconsin in terms of the different regional approaches that are available. It's important to look at what makes sense, because sometimes a neighboring jurisdiction may not have anything in common with you. Or state or county regions may not have. And so we can't be afraid to kind of cross traditional political boundaries to form new economic partnerships. I think, secondly, is once defined, their leaders are moving away by focusing on opportunities, okay, versus problems. And that's a different set of thinking. Focusing on opportunities versus problems. And the way they're doing that is closing triangles. And what I mean by that is, I know Jerry, oh my God, and I know Jerry. Jerry, I want you to meet Jerry, yeah. Jerry with a J, Jerry with a G. So I'm closing a triangle, right? And if you've heard me talk repeatedly about networks, and the importance of networks, but it takes different leadership. You know, in our grandfather's economy, it was all about hierarchies, right? In our grandchildren's economy, it's about networks. In our grandfathers, it was about command and control. In our grandchildren's, it's about link and leverage that linkage in a different way. In our grandfather's economy, it was about being vertically integrated. In our grandchildren's, it's about horizontally connecting our assets in a strategic fashion. It used to be about transactions, and we were all about making that next transaction and moving on. Now it's about relationships and how we can build trust within one another as a collection of communities and have a deeper relationship. It used to be about protecting our boundaries, right? Remember that invisible fence? And to your point earlier, in terms of being a little parochial, to strengthening the cores. And I'll be honest with you, as rural communities, this is the toughest. Because that core may be a bigger city, likely is a bigger city. So we may rise with the success of Madison, in Milwaukee, in La Crosse, in Green Bay. And we're going to have to celebrate their success as much as our success if we're going to look at this differently. So I'm going to give you an example. Fargo, North Dakota region, okay? We went to Fargo because they had the lowest unemployment rate in the United States. At the time of our research, it was 4.1%. Now it's at 2.8%. So they lead the nation. And it was interesting because we were thinking, okay, what are you doing? And they have some advantages from an economic perspective, but what we were struck is how even at a low unemployment rate, they are very aggressive in terms of advancing their region. And so what they've done is North Dakota State University, which is in Fargo, has connected with Minnesota State at Moorhead, just across the river. Two universities from different states don't usually connect like this. But what they've done is said, all right, how can we lead the world? What is our collective strength if we look at both institutions and say, you know what, we can be competitive globally? So they identified a few areas, and then they drew a 100-mile radius around Fargo-Moorhead. And then they did a cluster analysis, says, all right, how does that connect with the areas that we're pretty strong in? And then how do we transfer that expertise that we have at the university in the ivory tower out to these small towns to help them innovate, to help them do better? And so it's truly a regional strategy in terms of fostering innovations, improving efficiency, because the people in the ivory tower from the academy that I represent are all about connecting their assets to the smaller communities across the region. Not in every area, I'll be honest. They're picking winners. But they're picking winners based on those areas where they have enough bandwidth, enough critical mass to be able to compete globally. Okay? I talked about this earlier this morning, I apologize for that. So it's all about strengthening networks. Networks, networks, networks. I've said that repeatedly today. Well, what do regional networks do? I think there's really 3 C's that happen when we look at networks. One, it spurs conversation. It spurs conversation, talking to one another. Secondly, it enhances connections. So once we talk and we learn to trust each other, we get to a personal interaction stage. We say, all right, what can we do together? And then collectively, it builds capacity. So those are what I refer to as the 3 C's. It starts with discussion, conversation. From that conversation, we have connection, and that's going to build capacity. But sometimes to have this really take root, it takes some safe place for this to unfold. Because sometimes people get a little parochial when they come to the table. And so we have to have regular forums to really uncover some of these assets and to link these opportunities. So here's the audience participation for 3 minutes, because I want to keep us on time. Plus, I have a flight to catch. I want you to turn to your neighbor and think about your community, and then think about your neighbor that you turn to. Share what are those assets, and then think, how can we connect the dots? Okay? What is it that they offer that we offer that perhaps we can connect the dots? So we teach with our colleagues at Purdue University this approach called strategic doing, and we ask really 3 questions. What can you do together? So what's the possibilities? What should we do together? So we're kind of narrowing it in terms of saying, okay, that all the possibilities, here's some more tightly written set of activities that perhaps we have the ability to move forward. And then what will we do together? So that's your action plan, right? Then we always add a 4th, and when are we going to get back together, right? So that we keep it moving. And so I think, as you talk about working with your communities, just asking these questions will help really tee up a regional economic development plan. And there's a lot of elements that come together, but it really looks at encouraging critical mass, right? To be able to act locally but compete globally. It means looking at prioritizing your investments. That's going to really spur innovation and unlock opportunities to really transform that region's economy. So I want to give a shout out to a couple of your winners, because I think that they're a good example in terms of what's possible regionally. And so do we have anybody from Greene County? Yeah, so you ladies did a wonderful job, in terms of this is a regional, community-wide agritourism weekend, right? So different partners that perhaps previously hadn't had the opportunity to work to, and really celebrating local venues, but on a broader geographical scale than just one particular site, right? And so that's the start of really a regional effort in terms of what you've done there in Greene County. Well, congratulations on being recognized. And again, as I have an opportunity to kind of share my perspectives nationwide, you're now part of my slide deck, right? Oh, yeah, there you go. Vernon Trails, our other regional winner. Anybody here from Vernon? They may have had to head off. But again, a regional effort, really looking at a trail system. So again, looking at from a recreational perspective, how do we capitalize on non-motorized trails in a meaningful way? Bringing together a series of community events in a more coordinated fashion so you're not tripping over one another. 100% volunteer run, which is impressive in terms of what they're doing. So again, we work a lot with our colleagues at Purdue, and they have a Purdue Center for Innovation and Development, and they really have these different forums that kind of bring the opportunity for people to come together to tease out just what you folks did a little earlier in terms of turning to your neighbor. And they really have these civic networks that they've developed to talk about information. So look at this picture here. this group of ladies. And the one lady in the middle is from Kokomo, Indiana. And this happened to take place a week after Delphi announced that they were closing their plant in Kokomo, and I think it was 850 jobs. Really a devastating economic hit for that particular community. But what do you notice as you look at that lady in the middle? She's smiling because she has hope. Because she's talking to other communities that she's met at these forums and says, okay, yep, we've just had a hit, but we now have opportunities if I can connect with this person and I can connect her, exchanging information. This photo was not set up, but it kind of gives you the illustration in terms of the power of conversations, the 3 C's, right? And what we can do together and how we're going to move together. And it's really when we have the 3 C's that we can really foster prosperity. And it starts with collaboration. So you have that conversation, look at capacity, and you build at shared resources, and that will hopefully lead to collaboration. And it's through that collaboration, easy for you to say, that we can get innovation. If you look across the country, I think no one does this better than the California wine industry in terms of how they have brought together various pieces of their cluster in terms of UC Davis and the Mondavi Wine Institute that they have there, in terms of the advertising industry, in terms of the Convention and Visitors Bureau, in terms of the labeling. It's a lot of stuff coming together. But that's why California wine is now competing globally, right? Because they have triaged their resources in an effective way, perhaps better than anybody else from a very specific region. And we can learn from them. There's other examples. So I traveled to Corvallis, Oregon a few years ago. They have a regional initiative called Prosperity That Fits. And their partner, and then one of their initiatives is Austin, Texas. And I said, well, that's pretty interesting. That's a pretty long ways away. And here's the reason. So Hewlett Packard, the computer people, used to have a major facility in Corvallis. They consolidated operations in Austin. A lot of those computer engineers says, you know what, we kind of like living here in the Pacific Northwest. We're not going to move to Austin. And so they connected with their colleagues in Austin and says, you know, we've got a lot of talent here. Just because the jobs move, the people are here. And so they continue to work together on a very strategic way that no other company does in terms of keeping a talent base that's not officially tied to them. North Carolina's Research Triangle North. So you've all heard of the Research Triangle, right, in Raleigh-Durham? So this is a group of 5 counties, kind of in north central-ish North Carolina. Now the Research Triangle is kind of tucked away in the east. And these 5 counties says, you know, how do we tap into all the economic activity that's happening at the traditional Research Triangle? The reality is it's very expensive to do business in Raleigh-Durham. Land prices are extremely high. I mean, there's a lot of things because it's grown in such popularity. And so they have actually branded themselves as Research Triangle North. And they have connected, so it's more than just branding, because I want to make sure you understand that. They have purposely connected with the leaders of the Research Triangle and the institutions down there, or NC State, Duke, in North Carolina, and says, all right, how do we tap into the networks? How do we tap into the learning that you're doing and replicate it here? Because there's people perhaps that want to be part of your Research Triangle that just can't get in, right? Because of gentrification, for lack of better terms, right? They can't afford to operate there. And so they're all in. I mean, the traditional people say, yeah, we'll expand. Been very successful in terms of how they've been able to affect a part of rural North Carolina and tap into some of the innovation that's taken place there. I contend, though, that really as you look at regionalism, it's going to take a different type of leader. You're all leaders in this room. So you're going to have to do things differently. Again, where your grandfather talked about being very centralized in terms of how we approach economic development, what we need today is really distributed and shared leadership. It's not about one leader, it's about many leaders, right? It's not about command and control, as I mentioned earlier, but it's about link and leverage. We used to lead from the front, now we're going to lead from the front and the rear. A lot of different examples in terms of communities that are doing. I have a few of them here. I've got these presentations, by the way, on the side over there and there, so you can take this home with you. But here's just some examples in terms of communities that, regions I should say, that have come together, and you can see some of them really span states. Some of them involve tribal nations, like the one in Montana, focusing on different things, right? Each of them have powerful lessons that we can learn from, so I encourage you to kind of look them out. I have the websites there. I'm going to highlight a few communities that kind of struck me in terms of what they're doing. Peoria, Illinois. So they have recently finished construction on a Next Innovation Center. This is really a regional center that brings together their assets from across the region into one center. So they're bringing together key assets like Caterpillar, CAT, Bradley University, the medical center, the city, all together in one room. Not one room, 50,000 square feet, lots of rooms. But each of these companies and others have said, you know what, we'll lend some of our top innovative people to think differently with the people from the medical field, or to think different from the people from the university. So it's a shift in terms of thinking and sharing disciplines all under one space, essentially, to help expand the innovation that's taken place there. Moscow, Idaho, really a small town, population about 12,000 people, home of the University of Idaho, which is a small university, about 9,500 people. So not a very big place. So it was there that the mayor of Moscow says, you know what, we're not capitalizing on the assets that we have. Moscow, Idaho is 8 miles from Pullman, Washington, which is the home of Washington State University, a little bigger institution, probably about 25,000, 8 miles. So she took it upon herself and she branded this as the Palouse Knowledge Corridor. This is called the Palouse Valley, really productive ag area. And then she actually got some resources from private industry and put together a student innovation competition with a couple caveats. If you want to compete, top prize I think was $20,000. You had to have a team from both universities, from both University of Idaho and Washington State. And she kind of put all these contacts together, kids who kind of get together on your own. Well, let me tell you, so again, I come from the academy. And so when people start messing with our students, we get concerned. And so now these two universities started talking because she got the students talking. And it was just 2 years ago that these two universities, because of her effort in terms of getting them to talk together, actually created the first double institution department that actually crosses state lines. So very innovative. So again, mayors, community leaders can do that. You can be the catalyst to make this happen. Greater Milwaukee, in terms of what they've been doing, a Wisconsin example with regional clusters looking at water and how they can lead the world in terms of some of the research that's taken place, connecting both those at the various educational institutions as well as the water-related industries that are housed there in Milwaukee, or the greater Milwaukee area. There are lots of examples. I know you can't really read this slide, but there are examples across the country in terms of regions coming together and saying, here's how we can compete. Here's those assets that we can lead the world in. And they've taken that next step in terms of organizing them in a different way and working together regionally to make it happen. One of my favorite stories, and I talked about Columbus, Indiana this morning, but I'm going to kind of finish off with them because I think it's one of the most instructive. So they have a regional initiative that's really designed to increase household income by the next step, if you will, on the career. So if you kind of look at a ladder in terms of thinking, okay, for me to move on that next rung, here's the additional training that I'm going to need, right? And in their analysis, they said, you know, if we provided that training to get people to skills to be able to advance themselves up that next rung on the ladder, or perhaps two, we will do more to advance and improve household income than anything else that we can do. Pretty simple, right? And so they says, what we're going to do is have this very comprehensive job training. We're going to identify those clusters that we're the best at, that we can compete in, and then we're going to work with high schools and get it done, and community colleges. Went to the Eli Lilly Foundation, pitched her idea, and Eli says, you know what, we really like this. We're going to write you a check for $1 million to help bring this to fruition. But we want you to scale it down. We want you to really concentrate just on Columbus and doing this in Columbus. And the folks from Columbus, Indiana, and the chamber was the one who was leading it, says, you know, thanks, but no thanks. Slid this check over. Now, I don't know if they physically slid a check over, but it makes for a dramatic story. But they walked away from $1 million frickin' dollars. How many of you would do that? Because in their heart of hearts, they says, you know, this is all about regionalism. And we have to look at this much broader. And so they went on their way, and they worked with 34 different high schools across an 8-county region. And says, all right, here's the areas, here's the sectors that we have some capacity. And so let's try to get some students interested in this from a career path perspective. Let's build a training center or work with our community college to put together some special workforce, very hands-on type activity. The people at Lilly says, our bad. You guys were completely right about this. This is all about regionalism. And so they wrote him a check for $10 million. They had no idea that that was even in the works. And what that is constructed is regional, really a regional advanced manufacturing center to really be the hub for this workforce training. Very cool stuff. But again, it's looking at how can we advance our region and kind of stick into your intuition and making it happen. Now, there's a lot of lessons. You know, you have to create a home for these type of partnerships to emerge. It's got to be all about win-win. You have to reinvent governance, because sometimes it's our governance that really provides the speed bumps in terms of having these partnerships develop. Whoops. We want to encourage bottom-up community-based planning, because I think that's where the best thinking comes from. And as we've looked at successful regions, it really starts with the leaders. And these leaders recognize some of these new realities of economic development, as we try to illustrate, right, with the video. They build relationships that really bond their community across the region, and they possess that global view. They have their eyes wide open in terms of what the strengths and what the weaknesses are for their region and what it's going to take to succeed. And in doing so, they're very flexible and adaptable, saying, okay, let's just get at it. All right. I'm going to end with a quote. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, and become more, then you're a leader. And that's really what I think regionalism is about. It's about dreaming more, being more, and becoming more from a collection of communities' perspective. So with that, I thank you very much, and I'm right on time, almost.